All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, committee, and up for review today is that we're going to open hearings on House Bill 2340, and at this time we'll hear from Reviser Scott Abbott, and he's going to make it brief.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee. I will do my best, but it is a lengthy bill with many provisions. House Bill 2340 was sponsored by this committee. It would amend a number of provisions that relate to behavioral sciences professions that are regulated and licensed by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. It touches about 5 of their professions, as well as some general provisions for the BSRB. Just going topically by the bill, a lot of these are repeated for a number of the professions that are amended by the bill. So the first topic in the bill is postgraduate clinical social work supervisors. The bill would require that those supervisors be approved by the board as postgraduate clinical social work supervisors on and after January 1 of 2024, and would require them to pay a fee to be designated as board approved supervisors. The second major topic covered by the bill is reciprocity licensure. The current requirement for reciprocity licensure for professional counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and psychologists is 48 out of the previous 54 months practicing in another jurisdiction licensed as that profession. The bill would reduce that to the previous 12 months. The third topic covered by the bill is it would create temporary licensure, a new category of temporary licensure for social work programs that are in candidacy status for accreditation, to create kind of an alternate path for those programs that are in candidacy status but have not yet been granted accreditation for whatever reason. The next topic covered by the bill is for continuing education. First, it would provide a mechanism for a licensee to request a time extension to complete their continuing education requirements upon a showing of extenuating circumstances. This would apply to professional counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and psychologists. Also related to continuing education, the bill would change the current statutory requirements for continuing education for those same professions by reducing the number of diagnosis and treatment continuing education hours required in any licensure period, and add 3 continuing education hours to the requirement per licensure period in cultural diversity. The next topic addressed by the bill is temporary licenses for professional counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, and addiction counselors. This is a category of license for persons who have completed their education but are awaiting to take the examination for licensure. It would extend those licenses from the current period of 1 year to lasting for 2 years. The next topic addressed by the bill is reinstatement of licenses. First, it would decrease the reinstatement fee for those licenses who have been inactive for at least 12 months. And the bill would also establish a special 6-month temporary reinstatement license for persons who are seeking to be reinstated but are not current on their continuing education requirements to obtain that license. This would be for professional counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and psychologists. Next, the bill would also create a student temporary license for addiction counselors for those who are working on finishing their required coursework to obtain their license. It has a number of requirements related to an education plan that must be approved by the board and by the educational institution, as well as some other requirements in order to qualify for that license. Next, the bill would add a member to the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. The board is currently 12 members. It would add a 13th member who is a behavior analyst, a profession that is currently not explicitly represented on the BSRB. A couple of more minor provisions. First, for psychologists, it would change their licensure requirements. In current law, it requires that they demonstrate that they are of good moral character. The bill would change that wording to that they are a person who merits the public trust. This is more consistent with the other professions that are regulated by the BSRB, and this language is also more consistent with the language used by regulatory agencies and some other states. Finally, the bill would modify the behavior analyst disciplinary provisions to match that of their other professions. Very little, if any, substantive change, but simply puts the process and the structure of those disciplinary provisions to be more consistent with the other professions that are regulated by the BSRB. The bill would take effect upon publication in the statute book, and I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. Committee, are there questions for Revisor Abbott? Excellent explanation once again. Thank you. All right, committee, the first proponent we have is David Fye, Executive Director, Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Welcome, committee, David.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, my name is David Fye. I'm the Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Appreciate the opportunity to come before you and speak as a proponent on House Bill 2340. That was a bill that was requested on behalf of the board of the BSRB. And it does include a number of the changes. I think Scott Abbott from the Revisor's Office did an excellent job explaining some of the technical reasons, and I want to provide a little bit of context in terms of some of the discussions by the board in recommending and requesting these changes to statutes in front of you. Just for a little context, I did come before this committee a couple weeks ago and provided some background information on the agency. As a reminder, we are one of the licensing boards in Kansas, and we do license most of the state's mental health professionals, including social work, professional counseling, marriage and family therapy, addiction counseling, psychology, master's level psychology, and behavior analysis. And currently we have almost 15,000 individuals with a permanent license. There are hundreds that have a temporary license, and then we assist individuals with out-of-state permits and some provisional licenses as well. So there's quite a few individuals licensed by the agency. Additionally, as I mentioned, we regulate 7 professions, and so the board has a standing advisory committee that assists the board, and so there's 55 individuals that serve on that. So what you see before you in the bill is really a combination of thoughts and opinions and research and reflections by the board, and we believe that these will further the public protection mission of the board and also address certain issues such as workforce. As Scott mentioned, one of the items that we're requesting to be changed in the bill is a modification to the statutes for reciprocity for the profession. Currently, for most of the professions, there is a statute that says if you are from another jurisdiction and you want to practice in Kansas, you can either come across if you came from a jurisdiction that has substantially equivalent requirements for licensure, or if you don't, then there's other provisions that you would need to follow. And currently, that mentions that you would have to have practiced 48 of 54 months in that jurisdiction. But a couple years ago, there was a bill that was passed that shortened the length of time for reciprocity for members of the military community, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, and those that intend to reside in Kansas. And that has created a little bit of confusion concerning our normal reciprocity standards and the new standards for those groups of individuals. And the board discussed if it was appropriate to reconsider the reciprocity standards. And the board believes that it is appropriate to go ahead and decrease those years of practice down to match the standard that was put into that bill for military members and military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas. So they would request that you allow that statutory change to drop the number of years of practice down from 4 years down to 1 year in another jurisdiction for individuals who want to come through on reciprocity. Additionally, Scott mentioned that there was some changes to the temporary licenses the board was requesting for most of the professions under the BSRB. There is a temporary license that you can receive if you are meeting the other requirements upon applying for a license, but you still need to pass the licensing exam. And for most of the professions right now, you can practice for about 1 year. But we have heard concerns that individuals may be struggling to pass the licensure examination, and the board believes it's important to allow individuals sufficient time and also provide more security for employers. And so the board believes changing the standard from 1 year to 2 years for those temporary licenses would be more helpful for employers and also provide individuals more time to be able to practice under a temporary license before they are able to pass the licensure examination. Additionally, when we talk about the topic of workforce, there's been a lot of discussion about shortages in Kansas, and I think in a lot of other jurisdictions, they're having conversations similar to this. I think one approach to the topic of workforce shortages could be to look at the requirements for licensure and to consider what can we remove. But I would discourage you from taking that approach because I think from the public protection standpoint, there are very important requirements for licensure because we're trying to make sure the public is protected. So what the board has done is we've really tried to take another look at licensure, not just from individuals that are coming into the profession from the beginning, but also what else affects the number of licensees we have. have. For example, one of the main reasons we don't have more licensees is because individuals in certain cases allow their license to expire, either because of their own health, someone close to them, burnout, or other reasons they step away from the profession. And if we can be helpful in allowing more people to make sure their license continues to be renewed, we would like to do that. And so there's an item in the bill that allows individuals who are currently licensed, when they come upon their renewal period, if they have not met the requirements for continuing education, the bill creates a new pathway for them to request additional time, up to 3 months. And if they can show extenuating circumstances for needing that additional time, they can apply to the board for approval. And if they receive approval, they will get more time, which allows them to renew their license, to stay active, and then to meet those requirements. So I think that's a really important piece in the bill. Additionally, I mentioned the board is taking a comprehensive look at licensure, not just coming from the beginning of the process, but also other elements too. And there are individuals I mentioned that have allowed their licenses to expire over the years. But I think the board wants to take a look at, are there ways the board can be supportive of helping those individuals re-enter the workforce? And so for individuals who have a license that has been expired for over a year, there is language in the bill that would decrease the cost to reinstate their license in half. And then there's also a requirement currently that you would need to have continuing education hours from the last time period to come back. And so we do create a brand new type of temporary license. This would be a 6-month reinstatement license, which would be available for individuals who have not met those continuing education requirements. And they would be able to get that 6-month temporary license and be able to start practicing under that temporary license while doing the continuing education hours that are necessary for their license to be fully reinstated. And then once it is, they could apply for their permanent license to be reinstated for them. So this would be a way to get people back into the profession in a quicker period of time as well. Additionally, it was mentioned that the board is requesting creation of a new type of temporary license for individuals who receive their education from social work programs that are in candidacy for accreditation. This is a complex issue, and I've included some background information in my testimony, but I won't go into all the details of that. The summary of that is that for each of the professions, for most of them, there is a national accrediting body. And if someone receives their education from that national accrediting body that has accredited those schools, we are able to expedite their applicants for licensure. But for the social work profession, that accrediting process takes about 3 to 3.5 years. So it's possible that a brand new school starts and that the school is seeking accreditation, but they will have individuals come through their program and graduate before their school is accredited. And currently, right now, the agency has requirements that someone either receive their education from an accredited program or meet other requirements in licensure. And one of those alternative requirements in licensure requires that half of the student's education be received while physically present at the school. And for a new online program, that's an impossible standard to meet. So the board is taking 2 approaches to this. One is creating these new types of temporary candidacy licenses for these individuals who receive their education from a program that's in candidacy for accreditation, meaning it's part of that 3-year process where it's showing that there are sufficient checks that they are on pace to reach accreditation. And secondly, the board has submitted regulatory changes through regulations to change that standard from having to be physically present at the school to be able to have that in-residence requirement met, face-to-face contact with core faculty either in person or by screen, which would allow individuals from programs that have online programs that have face-to-face contact with core faculty to be able to meet that requirement. But I understand that there may be an interest in having that addressed in statute instead of the regulation. So if there is a way that we could handle that with an amendment to the bill to meet that requirement in statute, I believe that would be supportive of what the board is trying to achieve through the creation of these in-candidacy temporary licenses and the regulatory changes the board is putting through. So I just wanted to make you aware of that as well. Additionally, Scott mentioned that there is language in the bill that talks about a new type of student license. We currently do not offer student licenses under the BSRB, but for the addiction counseling profession, the board is proposing a creation of a new type of student licensed addiction counselor license, which would allow individuals that have already received 60 credit hours in addiction counseling or a related field and are interested in finishing the rest of their coursework to become a licensed addiction counselor. There's a process that's designed in the bill that would allow those applicants to be able to get an arrangement from an employer that intends to hire them after they receive their licensed addiction counselor license and would be willing to employ them as a student and and then there's an agreement they would have to make with their school that shows that they are on track to go ahead and meet those standards. And we think that would be a creative way to allow more individuals to join the workforce and be able to provide some of those addiction counseling services. So that new proposal is included in the bill before you as well. Additionally, there is language that would modify the continuing education requirements for licensure. Currently, all the individuals with permanent licenses under the board are required to get a certain number of continuing education hours based on the profession and levels of licensure. There is currently a requirement of 3 hours in ethics and 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment for individuals that are able to diagnose and treat at their level of licensure. The board had a comprehensive discussion on continuing education, and the board felt that it was important to value the topic of cultural diversity, and there are a number of states that are requiring continuing education in this area. However, the board did not want to limit the ability for student or licensees to be able to take classes of continuing education in different areas. And so currently the 6-hour requirement of diagnosis and treatment is a bit unique comparing our standards to other states. So the board determined that they would like to lower this from 6 hours per 2-year license period down to 3 and add a 3-hour requirement in the area of cultural diversity. And the bill does define the definition of cultural diversity as hours in professional development regarding age, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, language, national origin, race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. Additionally, the bill does include information that would require social work supervisors to become board-approved supervisors. This is in large part based on a survey that was put out for social workers back in December of 2021. And responses to that survey did show that there were some issues with individuals who had received supervision and also those that were providing supervision. And the board felt that it was important for the public protection mission of the board to have board-approved supervisors similar to what is currently being done for the professional counseling profession as well as the marriage and family therapy profession. And as Scott mentioned, there would be language in the bill to add a board member for behavior and analysis. That is a profession that came to the board back in 2014. And over the years, the number of individuals licensed in that profession has grown to nearly 400. But it's a unique profession, and the board values that it would be important to have a board member on the board who could speak to some of the issues for that profession and help the board better be informed about issues related to the public protection mission of the board. So that would increase the board membership from 12 to 13 individuals. Additionally, there are some statutes in the behavior analyst profession that when those were created, they were created a little bit different than most of the professions. So those statutory changes would add disciplinary remedies that would make it more consistent with the other professions. For example, right now, the limitations the board is able to do is to revoke a license or suspend a license, but for minor level violations of the unprofessional conduct, such as for a few hours of continuing education or things that are small, there's currently no remedy. And so this would allow the board greater flexibility to have some of those meet the violations that do occur. And then additionally, there is a lot of statutory cleanup in the bill you will see as well. There are definition sections where new terms are added to provide better clarity. There is restructuring to make it so there's not so many different sections of statute to combine those into others. There is additional language that has been added to clarify existing processes. We have heard from individuals from the public that have tried to read the statutes. They're having some difficulty really tracking all the different pieces. And so this is in a way to clean up our statutes and also help individuals from the public and licensees be able to understand the processes more cleanly. And so with that, I'll go ahead and I'll end my testimony, but I just wanted to share some of the discussions the board has had on those issues, and I'm happy to stand for any questions.
All right, I think what we're going to do, Dave, is we're going to take questions after we hear from all of our proponents. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, I have Kyle Kessler, Executive Director, Association of Community Mental Health Centers of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Kyle Kessler, Executive Director at the Association of Community Mental Health Centers. We represent all 26 licensed mental health centers around the state and appreciate the opportunity to appear this afternoon on House Bill 2340 in support of it. And as I've mentioned before this committee on a couple occasions, we have a major behavioral health workforce shortage in our state. And this bill, we believe, has a chance to be a behavioral health workforce bill, really, to help us with that shortage. So we believe that the board has done some good work on the bill overall. And when the committee works the bill, if and when you choose to do so. We have a couple amendments that we would suggest that we believe will improve the bill. One would be to add an expedited licensing process that would, and I believe your testimony says 5 days, but we've expanded that actually to be 10 days is what our request would be. And then for a licensing fee of $100. And part of the thought process behind that is that it's not uncommon for people to come into our state and, for example, military spouses is one good example. So if there's a spouse who is stationed at Fort Riley or at McConnell Air Force Base, and their spouse is a behavioral health professional, a clinical marriage and family therapist or social worker, sometimes they can end up waiting 2 or 3 months before they are able to practice. And so if they go to work for a provider, a community mental health center or other provider, it would be great if we had that opportunity or that option to do an expedited licensing process. And so the $100 licensing fee that we suggest is something that we believe that would give the board additional resources to hire staff, to more licensing and credentialing staff to be able to do that. The second suggestion we would make is to establish a community-based licensure program, which would allow someone who has just graduated with their master's degree to practice for up to 2 years at a licensed community mental health center without having to pass the licensing exam. But we believe, and this is an effort to address an issue that we've understood can occur, or we've got several reports of it occurring anyway, where people might not pass their exam the first time, and so they will immediately walk away from the profession instead of continuing to make bachelor's level money as, say, a case manager at a community mental health center. Then they still have the student loan that they're accruing and needs paid, so they will go find a different job at, say, a distribution center or someplace that pays more than a case manager, and they either will be delayed in coming back to the behavioral health profession or may not come back at all, even after achieving the master's degree. So we think that this would connect them with a community mental health center where they would get a lot of supervision, practice under licensed personnel, and then hopefully within that 2-year time frame be able to study and pass that licensing exam. So those are our two big things that we would ask the committee to consider when it looks favorably upon House Bill 2340. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Appreciate it, Kyle. Next, I have, this will be virtual, Becky Fass, Executive Director, National Association of Social Workers, Kansas Chapter. You with us, Becky?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and we can see you.
Oh, good, good. Thank you, Chair and Committee. I'm out of state for allowing me to present virtually. I am Becky Fass, the Executive Director of Kansas Chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. Licensed social workers are the largest provider of mental health services in Kansas and across the nation. Each of you will find us in your districts, in your nursing homes, hospitals, schools, and VA clinics. So in my 30 years of social work practice in Kansas, I have not witnessed previously such a tight and competitive labor market for social workers. The shortage of clinically trained social workers is far worse in Kansas than in our neighboring state. Kansas Health Institute recently reported only 67 clinical social workers in Western Kansas. So we asked this committee to mend out the board-approved supervisor mandate. This was taken out in 2021 by the Senate Committee of Public Health and Welfare. We believe this requirement will increase liability, overhead costs, and deter social workers becoming supervisors. Kansas has a very experienced clinical social workforce, highly experienced clinicians. 40% are over the age of 55. BSRB's own survey only showed support for this mandate from 43% of the respondents. The other thing I would just like to note with reciprocity, BSRB is lowering the master and bachelor level social workers to 12 months, but they're not lowering the clinical social workers. That is still 3 years in the bill. My national association with the Council of State Governments is working on bringing a social work compact, hopefully next year. And with that compact, social workers will be able to seamlessly move across state line. So we won't want reciprocity to be longer than our compact at the clinical level. So that should be brought down to 12 months. So we ask you, by amending out this language, this will ensure the next generation of social workers practice. It will be less red tape in our licensing system, and we as a social work workforce can assist the mental health needs of children and families. So thank you for your time and consideration.
All right, thank you, Becky. Appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to butcher this. Dr. Joe Scalesi, which is it? Scalacci. I butchered it. Thank you. Welcome to committee.
No worries. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee, for having me here today to testify in support of HB 2340, in particular, the temporary licensure, sometimes known as provisional licensure for social workers, of graduates of programs that are in candidacy. The University of St. Mary, I'm the director of the social work programs at the University of St. Mary, based out of Leavenworth and Overland Park. The University of St. Mary and the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, who are the founders and sponsors of the university, along with the Board of Trustees, decided to start social work in their tradition of service and charity as men and women for others. And so I came on to begin our social work programs in the year 2020 during the COVID year. I will tell you the future, which is now, of MSW, Masters in Social Work Education, is online. Almost all of Masters in Social Work Education is going online. Don't quote me on this figure, but a colleague of mine 2 months ago on a national conference call did a back of the envelope calculation and said he thought about 50% of all MSW programs are now running fully online programs. The MSW student wants flexibility and affordability. Flexibility and affordability. Online programs can deliver that, which is why we at the University of St. Mary chose to develop and proceed similar to our colleagues in the western part of the state, a state university in the western part, a fully online MSW program. I'm what they call an old school professor. I've been in the classroom for 20 years. I love writing on the board, but I have seen my young faculty, and they are really amazing at developing quality education in an online format. And so we followed along our colleague in the western part of the state's heels at the University of St. Mary and continue to develop our online program. However, Kansas is somewhat behind the rest of the many other states in the rest of the country in this area, because we have this catch-22 where graduates of our programs that are in candidacy cannot obtain licensure. And so it makes it difficult for a university such as the University of St. Mary to obtain and recruit students. And students want to come to your program knowing when they graduate, they can apply for and get licensure. And so it has been difficult. And in fact, I have counseled and advised a number of students in the state of Kansas who have chosen to go to programs in other states because they want the flexibility, they want the affordability, and MSW online programs in other states provide that. I came from a rural school in Illinois, and I can tell you the strong majority of my alumni from my former school in those rural areas all went into online programs. They just can't travel to the bigger cities or other areas to go into face-to-face online MSW programs. And so it really helps the rural population as well. And then students nowadays, they go online. They go on their TikTok or whatever it is they're going on, and they just put some things in, and they come back to me and like, Dr. Joe, have you heard of such and such university in South Dakota? You know, and I have to talk to them about that, but they are encouraged to go to other states. And so in some way, this catch-22, with this catch-22, we're losing business as a state. We want to retain Kansas students in our Kansas programs. The second thing I just want to make, in addition to my written testimony, which has been handed out, is that the candidacy process with the Council of Social Work Education, CSWE, is a rigorous accreditation process. It's a 3-year process in candidacy, and then you earn your initial accreditation. My first self-study was 1,600 pages to them. It is a peer review, rigorous process, and it is one that makes a check on quality. CSWE wants social work programs to have quality, and so this benchmark process that they have over 3 years, which is annual, over those 3 years, is one that is filled with rigor and makes sure that educational programs and social work programs are filled with rigor. So because of that, this temporary licensure proposal sort of recognizes that CSWE process as being one that has rigor and allows temporary licensure for graduates of those programs, and eventually those programs will achieve accreditation, and I believe there is language in the statute that allows for the continuation of temporary licensure and or the protection against programs that don't achieve full accreditation. So those were the two main points I wanted to make in support of temporary licensure. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Next, I have Kylie Child, MSW Practicum student, Children's Alliance of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Hi. Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. My name is Kylie Childs, and I'm the MSW Practicum student at the Children's Alliance of Kansas. The Alliance is an association of 19 private nonprofit child welfare agencies that provide an array of child welfare services, including prevention, out-of-home care, skill building, mental health, and substance abuse treatment. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of House Bill 2340. I won't ramble on long since Becky Fast said a lot of our recommendations that we had as well. So in general, we are supportive of the bill and echo those two considerations that Becky presented. House Bill 2340 proposed a board-approved supervisor mandate, which we have concerns about for the following reasons. We believe it'll add additional stress to an already overwhelmed workforce. We believe it'll limit supervision opportunities, particularly in rural areas, and further delay time to licensure and entry into the workforce to fill those critical needed positions. Additionally, we were pleased to see House Bill 2340 reduce the reciprocity requirement for clinical addictions counselors and psychologists to 12 months. This change can help streamline more licensed clinical professionals entering the Kansas workforce, and we would ask you to consider this change being applied to all clinically licensed professionals. Thank you again for allowing me to share on House Bill 2340, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next, I have Monica Kurz, Vice President for Policy and Prevention of Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman Landwehr, members of the committee. My name is Monica Kurz, and I am Vice President for Policy and Prevention at the Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ. My agency is a nonprofit serving as one of 4 988 crisis contact centers in the state of Kansas, and I'm very happy to be in front of the committee again this session. I am excited as a master's level social worker, a licensed master's level social worker, to be here to discuss a BSRB bill that we see as being very potentially supportive for the workforce issues that we are having in Kansas. As you've heard from other conferees, I think that we have some but-fors when we look at supporting this particular piece of legislation. Like others, I share the concern around board approval for clinical supervisors. In my discussions with our rural frontier providers, we hear very, very often about the barriers that stand between their staff and finding clinical level supervision that will get them to that next level of licensure. It's hard for us to envision putting another barrier in place, being helpful to getting the workforce that we so desperately need. I would also ask that the committee consider, as they work the bill, some changes that may allow for an expansion of the kinds of activities that would allow clinical level experience to be gained for master's level social workers. In particular, we are a proponent for looking at a change to include activities that include diagnostic impressions. Know that this is a bit different than what we've talked about today, but I come to you as someone who very often loses my workforce after they gain their master's level credential and then want to seek clinical hours to gain that next level of licensure. We are interested in any sort of change that would allow for the work that my crisis counselors are doing on the hotline, text, and chat line to give them that clinical level experience. I can tell you that we have a 50-year history of providing this service in the state of Kansas. And from my own experience, as well as what I hear from our counselors and folks who go on to hire my counselors, the types of work that we're doing in our call room lead to very, very qualified social workers. And so we are very interested in any measures that the committee would consider that would help to help us keep our workforce and also help move them up to that next level of licensure. So I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you very
Thank you.
much. Next, I have Mitchell Skidmore, LNSW, private citizen. Welcome to committee.
Hi, thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I'm happy to speak on this bill 2340 today. I am a licensed master social worker with a private practice here in Topeka. And I am in support of the bill, but concerned again about that board-approved supervisor mandate. When I first started seeking out a supervisor, which I currently have, I called around to 10 clinically licensed social workers here in the area, got calls back from 3, 1 to politely decline, and then spoke with the other 2 and eventually chose 1, right? And I practice here in Topeka, right, in a well-populated area with a number of clinical social workers. I'm worried that the additional requirements of CEUs for supervisors and that administrative requirement to be approved would further limit that ability. And for me, as someone who specializes in geriatrics, the clinical level licensure is of particular importance because only clinically licensed social workers can receive reimbursement through Medicare. Right, so as a licensed master social worker, I'm not yet, don't yet have access to that payer source to support my business, and also to provide the training I was well trained to do, right, with a specialty population. My other concern is with the current language that's in the statute for clinically licensed social workers to have 15 hours of particular education. As has been spoken of by previous testimony, social work programs across the nation are accredited through a very rigorous accreditation process. And many of the courses that are of concern to the committee, such as psychopathology, ethics, interdisciplinary collaboration, and referral, are things that are embedded in all social work programs through that accreditation process. So I'd ask the committee to consider removal of that, as it does create additional burdens to that, getting that licensure, but also getting to the point of being in training for that licensure. It took me approximately 45 days from submission of my application for training plan to be approved for that plan. And much of that time was spent back and forth with the BSRB about my education, as I wasn't educated here in Kansas. And they needed syllabi from the courses that I took, which luckily, as someone who was young and new to the profession, I still had on hand. But I can't imagine for a social worker who was maybe moving here 10 years or 20 years after schooling would still have syllabi from their graduate courses on hand. And so it creates this very difficult process when I find it unnecessary due to the accreditation process. So those are my comments on HB 2340, and I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. All right, committee, we have written only. Was there anyone else that had turned in proponent testimony that thought they were going to get to testify today that we didn't call on? All right. We have written only testimony from Laura Shaughnessy, Counseling Board Member, Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. We have Wendy Funk Schrag, Vice President, State Government Affairs, Fresinus, huh? What? Is she online? Okay, we'll go back in here in a minute then. and Tim Davis, PhD, LSCSW, and Michelle Rickhart, Midwest Regional Liaison, United States Department of Defense, State Liaison Office. And I do apologize. Apparently, we do have Laura Shaughnessy. Are you here for questions, Laura, or are you here to testify?
I'm here for questions if necessary. I'm under the weather, so I changed my testimony to written only. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. All right. That'll close the proponent side of our testimony. We have one opponent, which is Carrie Masinski, Chief Administrative Officer, Midland Care Connections. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and committee members. Thank you for having me. I am the Chief Administrative Officer at Midland Care Connections, which is a nonprofit that's all across, from here to Missouri. And we have actually 19 social workers, master's prepared social workers that work for us. And we have difficulty getting them licensed. So actually Mitchell, who gave testimony before, actually worked for us, and I could not do his supervision. So I am in opposition to a few of the issues. So the first one is on reciprocity. So I am an LCSW in the state of Colorado, and I was an LCSW there for almost 30 years. I am still licensed. I also was licensed initially in California. I have not been able to get my license here in Kansas. And the reason for that is because I cannot get Colorado to fill out a piece of paper that Kansas insists that the state complete. So anyway, it's really difficult to get reciprocity in the state of Kansas. And it limits the number of social workers that we can have here in Kansas. So I can still provide clinical supervision in Colorado, just can't do it here in Kansas. So I am opposed to having it be 36 months for reciprocity from another state, because again, these people have gotten their master's, they've gone through clinical supervision, they passed a test, and they have to then practice for an additional 3 years, which is a total really of 5 years before they could get reciprocity here. Let's see, the other piece that I am opposed to has to do with the board-approved supervisor mandate. Again, for someone who has provided clinical supervision to around, I think I counted up about 250 people. You know, over the years you forget their names, but I think it's about 250 people over the years. It is hard to get a clinical supervisor, like Mitchell was saying, and it takes a lot of time and effort if you do it really well. And so to limit the pool of people that are available to provide that, again, limits who can get their LCSW. So if you can't get your LCSW here in Kansas, where do you think people go? Somewhere else. Somewhere else where they can actually get their license. Again, if you've gone through 4 years of undergraduate, you've gotten 2 years of master's, most likely, and you've then done 2 years of hopefully clinical supervision, if you could find it here, and you still have all those student loans to pay back. You got to earn money. You got to earn enough to pay them back, and so I am in opposition of creating barriers for the few, and I say few compared to other states around us, LCSWs in the state of Kansas, to even further restrict who can provide that clinical supervision. So thank you very much for letting me testify.
All right, thank you very much. All right, committee, that's all that we have for conferees here today. So at this time here, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Everyone can't be that quiet. Representative Blacks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Was it David? I apologize for the Behavioral Science Board.
Yeah, and committee, as we call up conferees, if others have questions for the same conferee, make sure that you flag Representative Epley here so that we don't have them bouncing up like little jumping jacks. So, Welcome, David.
Yeah, well, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for being here. And I guess I have a question on what basis or possible studies in other states that the board believes, kind of from what I've heard today, there seems to be an overall shortage. You're looking at maybe lowering some barriers, allowing across state lines a little easier because there's a shortage of healthcare behavioral science workers. Am I correct in that thinking?
So I think in the mission of the board, there's a balance. Our number one priority is to make sure the public is protected. And so I think one of the important ways to protect the public is to make sure there's adequate individuals being able to provide services. So I think it's important we make sure the individuals who are providing services do so in a competent way, but also to make sure that our restrictions aren't unnecessary and keeping people from providing services that otherwise could. So I think it's a balance.
Okay, I appreciate that. And on that same line, I guess, on what basis does the board believe that adding the possible controversial cultural diversity requirement of 3 hours, do you think, is there studies in other states that indicate that's going to increase, or is this going to decrease your number of workers? Is this going to be a barrier?
And Madam Chair, if I might, the board has had conversations on that topic, and I think one person who could provide a really good source of information on this topic would be the board member who's in attendance today. She indicated that she was available for questions, and one of the questions that she would be able to speak to is the board's conversation and requiring that cultural diversity training. And she's on WebEx. It'd be Laura Shaughnessy.
Okay. Laura?
Thank you. May I respond?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my voice is a little hoarse. I'm sick. So there is no evidence that adding or increasing cultural competency around diversity issues is a barrier. In fact, there is data to show that it actually encourages people to go into our field because they can gain an understanding to serve more people. I have heard that comment many times when I've been out talking to folks about this topic. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, somewhat, but if there's no evidence, it's a barrier. And by what reason is there evidence that's going to increase?
Well,
any potential workers?
Yes. Well, sometimes I'll go to graduate programs at universities, and a lot of their questions are, once I gain my credentials, can I go out and serve unique populations that I'm interested in? And of course, the answer is yes, and hopefully, but here's how you gain competency working with those diverse populations. One of the main questions that I have had when I've been at 2 Kansas universities was, how do we get a hold of those rural people? And there are many things coming down the pike that are going to reach out to, those frontier folks. But one way that we can really support and represent them is by offering education and information about how to relate to them.
Thank you for that.
So that's one example. Thank you.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So your language on page 4, second paragraph, regarding Senate Bill 387, when that was advanced, are you saying that that DEI language was removed from the bill out of that Senate committee last year?
Yes, in my testimony on page 4, I provided a little bit of the history of the board's discussions on this topic. And so last legislative session, there was a bill put forward by the board of the BSRB that would have required continuing education in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion for licensed psychology. And when that bill was discussed by the Senate Committee on Health, it was amended out of the bill. So other provisions of the bill did pass last year, but that was taken out. And so that was the portion that affected the legislative session last year.
Madam Chair, thank you. And so this would represent 50% of the 2-year CME requirement. 3 hours of DEI and 3 hours of other for a total of 6. Am I understanding that correctly?
So our license periods are 2 years, and for each 2-year license period, depending upon what level of license you are in which profession, you either need to have 30 hours to 50 hours. And included within those hours, you have to have 3 hours of ethics. And then for the individuals who are able to diagnose and treat, they have to currently get 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment. So for those 2-year period, it would essentially lower that current 6-hour requirement in diagnosis and treatment from 6 to 3, and then add a 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity training for all licensees to 3 hours.
Okay, I understand. I have another question, Madam Chair. Thank you. Is there anything in this bill which would help our opponent's testimony? It seems like there's a catch-22 involving her particular situation. I'm sure there are others similarly affected. So is there anything in this bill which will rectify that problem?
And Madam Chair, just for clarification, was this regards to the individual who indicated that she was not able to get licensed by reciprocity?
Correct.
I'd like to be able to talk to her personally to find out more information about that. I can tell you that a few individuals who provided testimony have stated that for individuals wishing to get reciprocity for the clinical level, that they're required to do 3 additional years, and that's slightly incorrect. In the reciprocity statute, it provides an option, and you have to get 2 of 3 requirements if you're at the clinical level. And one of those 3 options is to practice 3 years at the clinical level in that area. The other 2 options are to either pass the clinical level license examination or to have an attestation from an individual at the clinical level who signs an attestation that you are able to diagnose and treat at that level. So we don't currently require that all individuals coming in through reciprocity have to have those 3 additional years. It's just one of the 3 different options. And for individuals that are not able to meet the other 2 options, they would have to do that. But there is some flexibility there.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Reese.
Thank you, David, for your presentation and your written testimony. It's very clear. Just because it's on my head, in my head right now, Representative Clifford spoke about that reciprocity, and you said something about there's 3 options. So if somebody does an attestation that you have the clinical skills to receive that license, does that have to come from their new employer in Kansas, or does it have to be from wherever they came from?
And Madam Chair, the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB, Leslie Allen, is currently in attendance today, and she might be able to provide a little more context on who that attestation would have to come from. Do you mind if she answers that question?
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Representative, the attestation can come from a previous employer. It can also come from a coworker that they, work together on cases. It doesn't have to be from their current or past supervisor.
Okay.
But it can be from either.
Okay, thank you. And that second requirement that you spoke about, David, I know there's 3 options, but what was the second one?
The second one would be to pass, to pass the clinical licensure examination, so that you could either pass the examination or have the attestation from from the relevant person, or have the 3 years of practice, as individuals have mentioned.
I have another question. Thank you, Madam Chair. The makeup of the board. What is the makeup of the board?
So right now there are 12 board members, all appointed by the governor. There are 8 professional members and 4 public members. Of those professional members, the agency was created when the social work licensing board and the psychologist licensing board are put together. And so there are 2 social workers, 2 psychologists, and then over the years as professions have been added, there's been 1 individual for those professions. So there's 1 marriage and family therapist, 1 addiction counselor, 1 professional counselor, and 1 master's level psychologist, and then the 4 public members that I had mentioned.
Okay. Is there any thought about making it more balanced? There's clearly way more social workers in the state, licensed in the state, than any of the other professions.
I think there has been conversation about the makeup of the board itself. Just to clarify, the BSRB is not an advocacy board. We differ from an association. And so I think one of the reasons why we have diverse representation as we do in terms of being a composite board is to allow there to be a professional member who can speak to the intricacies and the differences in the professions. And so I don't believe there's been conversations by the board in terms of having it proportional based on licensees. And I also believe that there's been conversation that If the board grows to be too large, it would be difficult to have work done as efficiently as we do. Right now we have 12 members. The board thinks adding one for the behavior analyst profession to have it be 13 would be okay. But I think if the board grew much beyond that point, it would become a little unwieldy to do the things that we are currently able to do.
Thank you.
Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. This is for David, and also Dr. Joe might want to kind of make his way back up here too. On the part of this that updates the presence of regulation as it relates to virtual education, will this put us on par with most other states then as far as virtual MSW programs?
So it's kind of a two-step approach. I think adding this new in-candidacy temporary license, it's modeled off of what is currently being used in Minnesota. And so they've had a lot of success with that to be able to allow individuals to work if they are coming from a program that is not yet accredited but is in candidacy for accreditation. So I think that will be helpful. I think also changing that regulation to make it so it's not, there's no longer an in-presence requirement of being physically at the school. I think that's also important too. I think both pieces in combination will really help open things up and allow more people to get licensed sooner, and then allow more people from online schools to be able to get licensed as well.
Thank you very much. And then if I may ask Dr. Joe a question.
Yeah, can we finish with David first and then go back?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that all right?
You're the chairwoman.
Thank you. Representative Bueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to the topic of continuing education, I'm looking at, and correct me if I have this wrong, currently the requirement is for 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders and then 3 hours of professional ethics. Is that correct?
That is correct for the levels of license that are able to diagnose. Some are at a low level, so they're not able to do that. So they just have a 3-hour requirement of ethics.
So for that level, is that the one that you're talking about, reducing from 6 to 3 the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders and then adding the 3 hours of cultural diversity?
Yes, for the level it's able to diagnose, it would be reducing that requirement from 6 to 3 and then adding a 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity. For the levels of license that are not able to diagnose, they currently only have the 3 hours of ethics requirement. So it would be a new 3-hour requirement for those individuals in cultural diversity training.
And so, I don't know, excuse me, if you're, I'm going to assume you're the one to answer the question. It seems to me that is, at least the first one, is a degradation of a core competency when it comes to behavioral health. And adding the cultural diversity piece is not really adding anything that's, I'm going to call it science-based. My spouse is a retired pharmacist, and I've dealt with her in her continuing education for years. And those things that I feel are at the heart of what that profession is, such as this one, that's the way continuing education ought to be structured. And it feels like when I look at your written testimony, and I do appreciate that, I was not able to navigate to the link to the survey. And so maybe we can get a copy of the survey itself and not have to go to the link to do it. But it feels like 40% of your respondents did not believe that this requirement needed to be, you had a 60% favorable and 40% no if you add up the no and the unsure. So I'm not sure that's a tidal wave of support for that requirement to change something that might not be construed as something as part of the core competency of this profession. So I guess maybe what I'm asking for is there something other than a survey and one question that indicated the change for this in your continuing education requirements?
And Madam Chair, on this topic, I did do a comprehensive examination of continuing education requirements in other states to see how our continuing education compared to other states. And I found that almost across the board, other states require some hours in ethics. But our current requirement of 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment was pretty rare. For the social work profession, I found that only one other state that I could identify has a requirement in that area. Now, some other states have requirements in other areas, and I found several that have a requirement in the area of diversity or something similar to that. So the board had a conversation about continuing education broadly and valuing both categories and also not wanting to limit the flexibility to take other hours. The board believed that there should still be a requirement of diagnosis and treatment, but perhaps not as many as 6. And they believed that there should be a value to the cultural diversity training too. So that was the opinion of the board after looking at the different types of continuing education required in other states.
Thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fye. I wanted to ask a little bit about folks' concern regarding the board approval of the social work supervisors. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the prevalence and nature of the concerns that led to the recommendation of that addition of the board approval, and then generally what's involved in that actual approval process in terms of time, cost, and process itself. And then as an add-on to that, do you have any initial estimates of how that will actually impact the number of the approved social worker supervisors in the state of Kansas?
So we do also not only license individuals, but we investigate complaints against individuals. And so I sit on that complaint review committee, and while I don't have a vote, I hear a lot of the discussions and I see the complaints that come in. And we do, from time to time, get complaints where it is clear that there was a misunderstanding by someone who was providing supervision to someone, and perhaps they gave them incorrect advice or information, or that they, maybe have done something that wasn't a good practice in terms of supervision. So I think that's part of this discussion too. In terms of the process by which someone would become a board-approved supervisor, the bill specifies that one of the requirements would be for those board-approved supervisors, each license period, they would need to get 3 hours of continuing education in supervision, of which one of the hours would need to be ethics of supervision. In terms of a one-time requirement, the other professions that require board-approved supervisors require a certain amount of continuing education the first time you become a board-approved supervisor. That would need to be something that would be determined in regulations if it matched the other professions. So that would need to be something for the advisory committee to discuss and the board to determine. I believe right now there's 15 hours for those professions, but for the social work profession, I think the conversation has been more in favor of a one-day training, so potentially something like 8 hours. That would still need to be clarified though. But essentially it would be to help the supervisors understand more fully their role in terms of helping out the people they provide supervision to. In terms of the cost, it would be a one-time cost, so you wouldn't need to do that every time you wanted to renew your license. It would be a one-time cost. The bill itself would set the cap at $50, and then within that, in rules and regs, the board would set that consistently with the other ones to put it at like $20. And so it wouldn't be a big revenue generator for the agency, but it would be consistent with the other professions that currently have that, which is professional counseling and marriage and family therapy.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. Do you have any idea about how that will actually impact the number of the certified social work supervisors, if at all?
I'm not sure how that will impact them. I believe we would need to reach out to those individuals who wish to become supervisors and make them aware of the new requirements if that was passed in the bill, and then assist them in making sure they're connected to the appropriate trainings.
Thank you.
Representative Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So change is inevitable, right? And as someone who was subject to continuing education in a prior profession, I appreciated how my current training trained me in the realities of today versus what I hoped it would be from the past. But can you speak to how adding the cultural diversity 3 hours, not only how does that help your providers provide services, but the impact that have on the person that's receiving those services?
Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, the board member from the board who's in attendance today, she could also speak to this topic as well. But I think some of the topics that she mentioned and some of the board has discussed is that, Kansas is a unique state in certain ways compared to some of the other states. There is an aging population. There are rural parts of the state. But there is also other topics, and I think the definition that the board is supportive of including in the bill matches the current language that is being required for licensed psychologists in Texas. They're currently required every license period to get 6 hours of continuing education in those cultural diversity topics. But I believe the board's discussion has been that they believe it would be helpful for licensees and practitioners to have a better understanding of some of the uniquenesses between the different groups of individuals they would be serving, and to encourage more of a spotlight on that topic and training. We've heard that some of the trainings may already require components of that within other classes, but specifically the board is supportive of requiring a certain number of hours in that area.
May I add to that, David, or Chairperson?
Yes, you may, Laura.
Thank you so much. Thank you. David said it eloquently, but what I'll add is that when we started this conversation, the first thing that we talked about was Well, we can serve our frontier people. We can serve our rural people by providing them with CEs that allow folks to say, if I'm going to go out and work in frontier, if I'm going to work with Native American folks, how do I go learn about them in a structured way? So the conversation began and stayed at that tailored message of, if I'm going to really learn about who I serve, this is a great way to do it. And that we want those services to the CEs, services of those CEs to be available so that a person can go out and tailor what they learn to the people they serve. Thank you.
All right. Representative Barth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this question will be for you as well. Everybody's brought up a lot of different areas, and one of the things I heard about the licensing piece of it is that basically they'd be given 2 years if they do not pass their licensing exam. The way I understand it, these folks have been to schooling and everything already, so that to help them prepare for the licensing exam, I'm assuming there's some studying that goes along with this as well. Is this licensing exam taken through like Pearson VUE, just like many of the licenses for life and health, for real estate licenses? Are they all administered through the same testing facility?
This one in particular is a national examination for the social work profession, but most of the professions have a specific standardized examination.
Oh, it's separate then. Okay, which that makes sense then. Okay, so how many people do you guys have taking the test per year here in Kansas?
So last year, we licensed about 1,500 new individuals. And within that amount, there were about 1,112 initial licensure. There were about 400 that came in through reciprocity. So the individuals we'd be working with that would primarily be taking that licensing examination, last fiscal year would probably be somewhere around 1,000 or 1,100 individuals that would be coming in through. And just to clarify, in terms of the temporary license, so if an individual applies for licensure and we have gone through and we've checked their references, we've checked their education, we've gone through to make sure there's no disciplinary issues, and then they've met the appropriate qualifications, but they still need to pass the exam, they have the opportunity to apply for a temporary license. And if they want to apply for that, that would allow them to work for up to 2 years while scheduling the examination, because we don't schedule the examinations for individuals. They need to do that themselves. We open up a window of time for which they can do that, but within that window of time, it's on them to go ahead and schedule the examinations, and if they don't pass, then they can schedule it again and try to pass it the second time, if that works.
And just one more follow-up question on that then is how many people actually fail per year then that don't pass the test?
And Madam Chair, I'm not sure of that number in terms of how many pass. We have 7 different professions, and so it would be different for the different professions and the different levels of licensure. One thing that is a bit unique about Kansas compared to some of the other states, don't have as many levels of licensure as we do, because our levels of licensure you can stay at for your entire career. So there is a different license examination that you would need to take if, for example, you want to be a bachelor's level social worker and stay at that level your entire career. So I don't know, but it would vary based on the different professions and the levels of licensure too.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Representative Berg-Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dave, this is for you as well. How many social workers' continuing education hours are audited every year? Do you know?
Yes, by statute, we audit 10% of all of our renewals. And then in certain disciplinary cases, there are, if you have a violation that requires you to be audited in the future, there are a handful of additional ones, but usually it's about 10% of all of our licensees.
And then I guess, are these hours, are most courses like certified, or is a lot of it kind of like subjective as far as does this pertain to the different buckets that they're required to do?
So for the social work profession, there is a way for individuals to submit a course ahead of time that meets certain standards to be a pre-approved course. for the social work profession, or someone could meet certain requirements to be a pre-approved provider. For some of the other professions, I believe some of their national associations have a method that you can apply to be a pre-approved provider or have courses that are approved. But for most of those, we look at the courses when the individual is audited. At that time, they would have to provide those documents to us, and we would review them to see, are there hours of ethics that are met? Are there diagnosis and treatment hours? And so that's when we would really look through to see if they had met the qualifications for those hours.
Just one last one. So then on the new bucket, it seems like it's a pretty expansive category. Would you provide like a list of kind of like qualified courses, or is it going to be kind of trial and error as you go throughout the time period to say this works, this doesn't work for those?
For the cultural diversity topic?
Yeah.
I think one of the ways that we tried to clarify that for the legislature and then provide more emphasis is to include those categories that had been required in Texas, just to name those that are required. But in terms of specific standards, the board has not had additional conversation on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
Wichita, or Representative Orpeza.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had 2 questions. I'm fascinated by this reciprocity with other people coming in and out from other states. So there is 3 options. One is an attestation, the other one is working 3 hours, and then you mentioned an additional test. Does that cover what they've already learned and have been practicing for years? And then what is the cost to that?
So there's a clinical level examination for the different professions, and so it would depend on the profession and how much that examination costs, but I'm not sure what the amount that would be. We don't facilitate the test. We open up a window of time and then they arrange for the test themselves, so we don't get any revenue from any of the examinations. But that would be something that they would pay directly to the test administrator.
Oh, thank you.
They would have already taken the exam in their previous.
Go ahead and step up.
Excuse me.
Say
They
who
would
you're-
have.
tell us
I'm
who you are
Leslie
and then- yeah.
Allen, the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager. For reciprocity, we accept the exam. If it was the clinical exam in their state, then that's what they provide. We don't have them take an additional test.
Thank you.
And I was speaking with Leslie a little bit earlier. Leslie's been with the BSRB for over 20 years, so she's seen a lot of the history and the changes with the agency. And she indicated that, there are certain individuals that are social workers who predate those tests, which I believe were established back in the 1980s. And so one of the reasons why there is some flexibility with that is for individuals who may have been practicing before the test was even required in their jurisdiction. So.
Okay, committee, is there anyone with further questions for David at this time? All right, seeing none, thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate
Madam
it.
Chair.
Representative Epley, and I believe that rather than Butcher, it's going to be Dr. Joe.
Sounds great. Dr. Joe Scalacci, University of St. Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Joe, for coming back to the mic. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a pretty easy question. I think it's kind of clear, but I want to make sure I understand the lack of statutes as it relates to virtual education. Has that been somewhat of an impediment for some universities in the state of Kansas?
Indeed, it has.
And so with the passage of this bill, hopefully, or getting it out of committee and then to the floor, getting it passed, would this facilitate University of St. Mary and other universities getting their full accreditation more expeditiously?
Absolutely, it will allow us to recruit students, and part of that accreditation process is giving CSWE, the accreditor, information about student learning. And you need students to be able to tell them how much students are learning, so absolutely.
And through the pandemic, that was somewhat of an ongoing struggle, if you will, with the virtual capacity or virtual component to it.
I remember going to conferences in about 2013, so about 10 years, where online started taking off. There were a lot of reservations about it, but COVID just exponentially has made pretty much master's and doctoral education across the level move towards online learning.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your responses. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, committee, are there any further questions? All right, seeing none, that will close the hearing on House Bill 2340. Now, we're going to work House Bill 2264 that we heard last week.
Madam Chair, I have a motion.
Give you time to pull that up. such as myself. All right, Representative Epley.
Thank you. If we're ready, Madam Chair, I would like to propose that we have passed House Bill 2264 out favorably for passage from the committee.
Seconded by Representative Clifford. Discussion, comments on the bill. Representative Barth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this an updated revised 2264 with amendments?
That's coming.
This is where we start offering amendments for the bill that we heard last week.
Okay.
It's going to happen.
I'm sorry. What'd you say?
Yeah, so if you've got amendments, this is where we want to take and do amendments on the bill. And I believe that you may have had one.
Yes, I would like to offer some amendments, if you don't mind, please.
Supervisor Abbott has it, I assume. We actually get to work a bill. If you'd like to, go ahead and explain your amendment while it's being passed out, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So my amendment applies to 2264, there around line 26, 27 there, where really, I like this overall bill. I think that it is somewhat limited on the folks that are allowed to be able to visit the patient. So this would expand so that it would state that any person designated by the patient, if the patient has the capacity to make such designation, or any person designated by the patient's agent for healthcare decisions, established by a durable power of attorney for healthcare decisions pursuant based on the law. And amendments there too. If the patient does not have capacity, such visitor may include, but shall be limited. So it goes into the other language, but this would expand it. The reason why I added this is that I know there's been an issue with who can visit, and this would expand that so that other folks would be able to visit someone who is in the hospital. So if you had a neighbor or somebody that was close to you, you could determine that could be, or this could be someone's daughter-in-law or something to that extent. So it allows for additional expansion of people to be able to visit a loved one that's in the hospital.
All right, you've heard the motion. Is there a second on the Barth amendment? Seconded by Representative Blex. Discussion on the amendment. Questions, discussion. All right, Representative Barth, you may close.
I would appreciate support in voting yes for this amendment to 2264.
All right, you've all heard the motion by Representative Barth, seconded by Representative Blex. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Other motions, amendments? Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have amendments a little more expansive and somewhat comprehensive, and I'll ask Scott to pass it out if he could, please. It encompasses several of the stakeholders' input on this bill and tries to represent their desires for this bill to make it a better bill, which includes Leading Age, Kansas Hospital Association, and others. And it does expand the list on page 1, line 16, to include domestic partner and significant other, somewhat similar to what we just heard in the other amendment, but again, it lists people. On page 2, at the very top line, line 1, changes the word shall to may, so that this will allow more flexibility for extended care facilities, particularly assisted living facilities, to have more flexibility in going forward with infectious disease protocols. And then the next line down on line 2, including but not limited to, all the things listed there. So again, there's more flexibility provided, particularly for extended care facilities. And then the next balloon is a patient may refuse in-person visitation. And this just gives the patient, it states it, it codifies it. I mean, this is a known thing by providers, but any patient has a right to revoke or change who's going to visit them in the hospital. And we just want to codify that so it's in writing. Going down then to line 23, on the same page, page 2. It's in brackets 2. There was kind of a mistake made in drafting the bill. I hate to say mistake, but it was too limited. It said medical care facility. We made patient care facilities to include all patient care facilities. So it will include nursing homes and assisted living facilities. So we want to make that drafting change. And then on line 41, insert the wording as listed there. Notwithstanding subsection F requiring a visitor to adhere to infection control procedures, including wearing PPP. This was a concern by some of the stakeholders that we don't have it specified that, visitors might have to wear PPP, and I think that's important that we represent that concern in the amendment. So that's gone forward in this. And then finally, a large amendment over on page 3, again, from the stakeholders involved, that it encompasses essentially 2 things in that balloon, which basically says that the patient care facility will be immune from civil liberty liabilities in the event of a caregiver visit having some negligent or willful or wanton or reckless conduct as outlined there, that they're immune from that civil liability protection. And that's just in this situation to protect them. They wanted that represented. And as a healthcare provider, I understood that, and I think that's important. And finally, and last but not least, and this is just to understand that we codify this so we understand we're not trying to supersede any federal law or legislation that exists. That's codified in the second part of this balloon on page 3 on line 2. So again, we will not supersede any federal law, rules, regulations, or guidance regarding patient care facilities. And that's, in essence, what all the amendments say, and Scott may have some further contribution to what I tried to just outline to you. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, you've heard the motion by Representative Epley. Is there a second? Representative Reese?
Sure.
All right, discussion, comment on the amendment. Representative Berquist.
Yes, I'm going to comment on the bill itself, so I'll hold.
Okay. All right, committee, and this here, I could do a substitute motion, which I would prefer not to do, but there's a small change that I would ask the maker of the motion, and the second, if it would be all right, is on page 1, where they have the balloon on line 16 after spouse, domestic partner, significant other. That would be moved down to line 28. So it would read an immediate family member or domestic partner, significant other. Is that all right by the author and the second?
Fine with me.
All right. You got that, Scott? All right. Now we're on the motion to amend by Representative Epley. No discussion, comments? Representative Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So right up front at the top of page 2, when it changes it to may instead of shall. So this is about the facility actually establishing any visitation policies and procedures. So does that mean they have the choice of whether they adopt these or not? So they could go with a strict nobody allowed? Help me on that. Thanks.
Revisor Abbott, would you have an answer to that? To clarify, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative, this would refer to that list of topics that a facility could, or under the original bill, would be required to establish policies for, the 1 through 4 immediately under that, the infection control protocols, the schedule, the allowable visit length, and the limits on the number of visitors. It would still be subject to the baseline requirements of the bill, so the people who are allowed to visit or be designated as a visitor, the limit to 2 visitors as kind of a floor, all of those requirements would still apply. It would just be those 4 topics that the facility would not be required to adopt a policy on.
Does that answer your question, Representative Turner?
So like the length of the visit is one of the optionals back here, right? So number 4, I'm sorry, it's number 3. So what's the baseline length of a visit that would be allowed if they didn't adopt these, I guess is my question. Thanks.
Madam Chair, Representative, so there is no requirements in the bill for a minimum or otherwise determined visit length. You'll see below that there's some flexibility given to the patient care facility in subsection E about allowing in-person visitation except for certain circumstances when the patient objects. Those are related to receiving terminally ill or end-of-life care, making major medical decisions, those types of issues. But nowhere in the bill does it say there has to be a minimum visit length established.
Thank you for that clarification. I guess that's kind of what my concern is here, is that it seems like the baseline, as you've clarified, establishes kind of some basic stuff, but but absent having a schedule of dates and times when people are allowed, how long those visits are, then it doesn't seem that it matters who you've said can come, because if the place chooses not to set up a schedule, then there's never a time they can come. That's my concern. Thank you.
Committee, other questions? Do you want to go first?
Can I respond?
Representative Epley.
Well, just to try to clarify for you, all hospitals and all nursing homes have established protocols that we need to follow, and that's what this is to provide for. But extended care facilities don't all codify that. They need some flexibility, and that's why that word was changed from shall to may. And this is to cover those facilities so that they'll have that flexibility, because they don't have, there's no extended care facility that I'm aware of that has a nurse present 24/7. Lots of times they don't, especially at night. And this is to facilitate that so that they are not held to the same, basically they've got the flexibility to have some variances there, and that's why that word was changed. I hope that helps you understand better. Thank you.
Representative Blex, and then Representative Burkamp.
Thank you. Somewhat of a comment. Maybe we ought to change it on the first line with the intent is no patient left alone. If we change from shall to may, then we've lost the game. We might as well change that name, because actually, if you look at it down there, they shall establish it, but then in line 10, we can allow in-person visit. And then if you go down to line 31, a patient care facility may. So we have restrictions. I'm totally against this may for shall, my opinion.
Representative Berquist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree. I thought the whole purpose was to kind of codify guaranteed hours, and to me this makes it seem that we're taking that right away and essentially takes the meat out of the bill in my mind. Thank you.
Representative Reese.
I guess the way I read it is if it is shall and limits on number of visitors, it could be that maybe, instead of us saying, here are the number of visitors you have to have, we leave it up to the facility. What if they say 10? 10 is good. I just feel that just putting in the word may kind of opens that up a little bit, adds a little bit more flexibility to the facility to allow a lot more visitors and a lot more length of time than us trying to set something.
Madam Chair.
Representative Epley.
It gets tedious when you try to figure out everybody's visitation policy. This is to allow flexibility, folks. This is to allow hospitals to have their same protocols they have, nursing homes to have their protocols, and it's to allow extended care facilities to also comply with this law. If we don't make this change, then it basically is going to make visitation to assisted living environments impossible, because they can't comply with this law as it's written currently. So it's trying to thread the eye of the needle to still honor the current visitation policies by hospitals and by nursing homes, and yet also honor the visitation policies by extended care facilities. That's the wording solution that we came up with at the time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, and I think if you look at that from another direction, is that you could, if you leave the word shall in there, they could probably then, they'd have more ability to actually be, I think, be somewhat stricter on their established visitation policies versus being flexible with the word may. And I can tell you that the language that you're seeing before you is a compromise with those that were opposed to this bill from the beginning. So that's why we're where we're at today. Representative Berquist.
Madam Chair, I think the wording that's being removed and modified, that's what the people were most concerned about being able to have as family members, and I think the intent of the bill is debilitated by this amendment. Thank you.
All right, Revisor Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to offer some clarification, the bill would still establish a general rule on page 1, beginning on line 25, that a patient care facility shall not take action to prevent a patient from receiving in-person visitation from, and then with the previous amendment, the list of persons who may be designated as a visitor, which is now anybody designated by the patient. The language on page 2 gets more into the specifics of the policies that the facility may establish, but that's still subject to that general rule on page 1. And as I mentioned earlier, the subsection E on page 2, or I guess actually further down on G, there's already some flexibility built into the bill about certain circumstances where the patient care facility may adopt different procedures, most of them in line with the needs of the patient. But none of the amendments that have been discussed so far change that broad general statement on page 1 that the facility shall not take action to prevent visitation subject to these other requirements.
So what you're telling us is line 26 and 27 is kind of the meat of what it is that we're discussing, and that's what does not change, and that's the goal of the bill. Representative Burkham.
Thank you. And I guess maybe just how it's organized, but I thought during COVID, hospitals essentially shut down all visitation. So to me, I don't understand where this bill would explicitly say they cannot do that, because to me it looks like it says they shall not, but to me it doesn't prescribe any place where they will set visitation hours. I just am kind of lost on maybe the logic of the order of operations here.
Well, and I think it's, okay, if you look at line 25, which is C, a patient care facility shall not. And that's where lines 26, 27 comes in and says, so they shall not take action to prevent a patient from receiving in-person visitations from. And then it comes down on the list.
But I think that's where we need then the schedule to say the hospital or whatever facility shall have, because it's probably not going to be between like 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. I think they're still going to have some sort of guideline. I just, in my mind, I still think it would make sense to have some type of statute that would say they need to outline here's kind of our standard visitation hours. Otherwise, I just think it's vague, and I think we just run into this issue again down the road. I may be wrong, but that's just how I think about it in my mind.
Well, and I think, we have to look at, patient care facilities different than we would a retail operation or other types of operations. And some of these, it's like, for example, the shutdown for our nursing homes was not the state of Kansas, and it was not the nursing facility. It was CMS. It was the feds. We had no choice. And this here may not alleviate that should that ever happen again. Because CMS controls the biggest purse strings for a nursing home. 60% of their budget is federal dollars. We can't make that money up. So I think that the language is clear that the patient care facility shall not take action to prevent a patient from receiving in person. But this over here then gives them the flexibility to make their plans depending upon what situation is that they're dealing with and what type of a patient care facility is it. Because this isn't just about hospitals. It's not just about nursing homes. It's given that variable. And if you've ever been into some of these facilities or talked with some of these folks that work in them and manage them, that flexibility is important for them to be able to make as many decisions as they can make. And I don't think that this may or shall in here takes away from what's on page 1 of the bill. I think that is very clear in page 1, what they can do.
I wish it was better defined in that section now, if that's where
How would you define it better? A patient care facility shall not
well, I think there should be some sort of maybe minimum or some type of guideline on.
How are you going so you want to take and tell a hospital or a nursing care facility or some of our other care homes what they can and cannot do down to a narrow amount in statute? Keeping in mind that these are difficult to change.
No, I agree. I was just thinking that if we want the family to visit, they don't have any, I guess there's no recourse from us to make them do that if they don't want to, which maybe is fine. Maybe I misinterpreted.
They don't want to. They don't have a choice. They shall not. Shall not. Shall. That's where that shall is important.
I'll just leave it at that.
This one here.
I still don't agree with it, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay, but do you not see why that shall is probably the most important shall that's in this statute? Okay. All right. Representing Blacks.
And I tend to agree, that shall not, but also if that shall not is that critical, then why are we neutering it with all the amendments on the other one, on the back page? To me, and I may be wrong, but it looks like we're just kind of saying shall not, because like I say, the original intent of the bill was to make sure that I could visit grandma before she died. It's that simple. I mean, that's it. And now we're taking this thing and kind of throwing a kick in the can. We're saying they shall not, and then we're turning around and introducing a bunch of amendments that says, well, and I realize we have all these different standards, and I know there's certain situations, but, well, I think we need to send a clear message that, we don't want to go through what we've done in COVID again and make the same mistakes and not see or be able to be with our loved ones when they die. And I have some problems, I guess. Maybe it's just my simple mind. It's not really clear to me on that, but I don't want to water down or dilute the intent of this overall bill, which is being with grandma if she might die. And I'm not sure how to fix it.
Right. Well, and I think that's why when you come in with the third balloon down there, that a patient may refuse in-person visitation or revoke previously granted in-person visitation from any person anytime, that's something that allows the patient authority that they may or may not have had. And then we come in with prior to September 21, each patient care facility may establish visitation policies and procedures, including but not limited to, and then it comes down with their infection controls protocols. And again, that's something that some of it we may or may not have control on. Set schedule of dates and times when visitation is allowed. I think that's a flexibility that they need to have. Allowable visit length, limits on powers, because a lot of times, sometimes on some of the ICU stuff, there is limitations on how long you can be in an ICU. It all depends upon the patient. It's kind of an individual type of a situation. So I guess I don't see it as, because the author of this bill, which is Representative Epley, is fine with this language. And he's wanting to do the same goals that we all want to have happen as well, because we don't want what happened during COVID to be revisited. I agree with that. And I can guarantee that our hospitals and our nursing homes weren't happy with it either, but they had no choice. Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I know we're over time, and I'll really try to be brief. But you have to understand that when you take a bill like this, you have a lot of stakeholders. And I heard from the stakeholders, and there would have been a strong lobby against it had we not made these changes that articulate the capacity for the patient to make changes, the capacity for different types of facilities. Not all facilities are the same. You know, when you talk about extended care facilities, you're talking about hundreds of facilities in the state of Kansas. They could not comply with this. They would not meet, they would be in violation of state code, and therefore they potentially could be closed because they can't comply with this bill as it was originally written. So we heard their views. We talked to the smart revisers, and that's why we came up with the wording change that we did to allow extended care facilities to have flexibility in their infectious disease protocols as it applies to staffing and so forth. And so you know, we have a common intent here. I have the same intention you do, that whether it's grandma or your wife or your loved one, that you can be with them, and that's what the bill still says. We've still kept the intent of the bill intact going forward, trying to accommodate for the stakeholders who had a lot of input into this, because I didn't want them to lobby against it and defeat it in the process. And there was strong sentiment against it. So I listened to the stakeholders. You can't have everybody there when you have these things drafted, but we drafted the best amendments we could come up with to try to make to maintain the integrity of the bill and yet honor the stakeholders. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further discussions, Representative Bryce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have to say I have difficulty with page 1, lines 25 through 27, because of an emergency department point of view. Especially, I know we always fight the previous war, you know, when we're dealing with things, but during COVID, when we were seeing, you know, I was seeing 200 COVID-related patients a day. We were treating them in the parking lot. They were unable to even get into the parking lot. We were treating them in the streets with PPE. If this had been in place and we had allowed patient visitors, they would have crushed our emergency department and we would not have been able to function. I am against this because I believe as we say, stakeholders, those that are closest to the patient, making decisions for the patient, those that are giving their lives, having their careers, taking care of the patients, they need to be the ones to make these decisions. I'm just afraid if we try to impose this kind of thing on those people, like God forbid another thing like COVID comes up, this could crush emergency departments are not bottomless resources. They can be overwhelmed, and same thing with Ebola. When we were treating Ebola patients, if we had Ebola was at least 50% fatal, it was contagious even through the PPE. If we had to have family members with the Ebola patients, and when I was working in the emergency room in Dallas, no telling what kind of public health problem it would have been. That is just as an example, that was a different state. But I'm opposed to this because it takes the decision-making from the people on the ground, making the decisions, seeing the patient, talking with the patient, and we're trying to impose something on them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd be in support of this. I think there are reasonable precautions. There's reasonable latitude for the facilities. No facility in its right mind would operate without these visitation procedures, so I would be in favor of moving this.
Well, and I might say, as I did have conversation, as Representative talked about, with some of the stakeholders on this, and they were opposed to the original bill, and that's why you see these amendments here before you. And so it became a compromise so that we can move it down the road, because at some point our emergency legislation expires, and then you've got nothing. So this here is a path forward. Representative Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for all the conversation. But I guess I'm still where I was in the beginning, and that's that I think those earlier lines on page 1 point to one thing, but page 2 says that they have to adopt a policy, and that it doesn't dictate what the terms of those policies are, but that they have one, so that when you go and ask that they have to have policies on these things, they can be as restrictive as they would like them to be, but it does require that they have something, so you at least know what the guidelines of the game are. But thank you.
Further discussion, questions on the Epley amendment? Representative Barth.
I just wanted to make one more comment. I think we need something in place, because without something, we are going to be in the mess that we're in now, which is even patients have nothing to do with COVID, where they can't see their loved one, and that is a huge, huge issue. I think that if we all commit to the fact that if we see there's an issue going forward with this something better than what we have today in place, because I can tell you that I spoke specifically with someone who lost a loved one who was not able to be in the hospital with them, that would have maybe been a life-changing event for them to be in the hospital with them, that they would say that they want them there all the time. So I know that there's some restrictions at the hospitals, and this is a very emotional thing for a lot of us who have lost someone that we love that we wish we could have had there. Maybe they'd be here today. And so I want something in place, because without this, you know, I don't want to continue down a negative path even without another pandemic. We have an issue that we need to address. If hospitals are limiting people to some extent, I would say we call an emergency session and fix it, because it's not okay anymore to have these problems. So I know we got head shaking there on that, but let's hope they don't do that then, like, right? We want them to do the right thing, and I think they get the message. I think they hear us. They know our hearts and know where we are for people that we want to have good things happen. So I could support it if we had some commitment in the future to do something about it if it did go wrong again, and hopefully it doesn't. Thank you.
Well, and what happened with COVID was awful. And I would be absolutely shocked if we went through what we did during COVID again. But we want to put some safeguards so that it doesn't, and that's what this bill does today, is it advances it forward. So, any other questions or discussions on the Epley amendment? All right, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion carries. All right, committee, that concludes our business for today.
That's the amendment.
Oh, that's the amendment. Excuse me. I'm jumping ahead. Okay, that's on the amendment. Now we're back on the bill. Representative Epley, would you like to renew your motion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And without further ado, I'll just simply say I close on the amended two amendments as presented on this bill.
Seconded by Representative Reese. Discussion, comments. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion carries. All right, so that finishes that bill. So now we're at the conclusion of our business today. Keep a heads up. Look at the bills that you're seeing on our agenda. It is my intentions to work each and every one of those bills. So if you've got amendments, make sure that Revisor Abbott you've visited with him so that you have them in advance, and so that we can present them. Our goal will be, as I told you last week, if we have to, we will work on Friday in order to complete said business. So we are adjourned until 1:30 tomorrow.